All right, so my goal today is to get as far through this, and maybe even all the way through this invitation to know Yahweh theme, and then next week jump into Hosea 1. That will be the goal. We're only going to look in detail at the first 3 chapters of Hosea, but if you pick up on these major themes as you're reading, particularly part 2, 4 through 11, you will see this invitation. It's kind of back here covered up by my title about knowing Yahweh. And so what I'm giving you today is kind of for the middle portion of Hosea, but it is a massive theme. And I didn't realize how massive and extensive it was until I actually started researching Hosea for these lessons. So we're going to start with this contextualization of covenantal ideas in Hosea. We need to talk a little bit more about covenants and just clarify some terms here to understand how Hosea is using his language that we talked about last week of marriage and sonship, and how he's talking about knowing Yahweh, because it stems from the covenant. Obviously, covenants were common things in the ancient Near East. Yahweh uses covenants to reestablish relationships with humanity, starting with Abraham, until it is eventually offered collectively to all of Israel at Sinai. And the point of a covenant is to establish relational parameters that will enable the ongoing function of the relationship between multiple parties involved. So a covenant is a binding legal contract. It is a treaty, if you wanted to call it that, between nations or parties. It is an agreement between two people or two peoples, oftentimes. So marriage is referred to as a covenant in the Bible, and God is working in covenants to make these agreements where He makes promises and the people have to make commitments to Him. When the people's commitment to Him does not pan out, or they let go of their commitments, they break the covenant and God's promises don't get fulfilled, or in the case of the Sinai covenant, all of the negative promises get fulfilled, because He says, I'm offering you blessings for obedience, but I'll curse you if you're disobedient. So when their commitments to God fall off and they get slacked and end up worshiping other gods instead of remaining faithful to Yahweh, all of the bad promises actually end up paying off, leading up to and climaxing in exile. So this is where we're at in Hosea, tying that in historically. I mentioned this last week, but let's review it. In the ancient Near East, when parties involved were not equal in status, they were referred to as suzerain vassal type treaties or covenants. Usually in modern English scholasticism, you're going to find it suzerain vassal treaties. Treaty is just another word for covenant in this context here, okay? Because usually when people were making peace treaties in the ancient world, they referred to them as covenants. Covenant between me and you. The suzerain is the higher status person. It is the liege lord to whom the vassal owes honor, obedience, usually tithes and payments, tribute of some sort. The vassal then is the lower status person, the one who is deferent to the suzerain and hopefully gets certain benefits in return. If you were conquered by a previous administration, for instance, in Assyria comes down and conquers you. Assyria was not known for making peace treaties or covenants with its people. You were just wiped out, and your people were dispersed around their, it wasn't just Israel. They were dispersed around their Mediterranean empire throughout Mesopotamia and the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So they didn't really do this, but when other people like Babylon and Persia would conquer you, they'd make a covenant with you or something, and you would pay the price, and the king of Babylon or the emperor of Persia was known as the suzerain, and your people were the vassals. You become a vassal state. Israel rebels against Assyrian's imperial power because they were supposed to be a vassal state, even though there was no covenant really instituted that we're aware of when Assyria first conquers them. So that's why they come in 722 and just boot them out of the land. Deuteronomy is structured as a suzerain vassal treaty. As far as we can tell, suzerain vassal treaties seemed to emerge with the Hittite Empire, which is a small empire, very if you're looking at a map of Israel in the ancient world, the Phoenicians are directly above them to the north, and that's where the Baal worship comes from. And above them was the Hittite Empire, and it was kind of what you would think of as a mini empire. As I mentioned before, Assyria was the first world empire of that day, conquering all the land. But the Hittites seem to have formalized their suzerain vassal treaties, inventing it and giving it a specific structure. Deuteronomy is intentionally borrowing that structure so that the suzerain is Yahweh and the vassal is Israel, and this is the agreement that Israel and Yahweh are making together. They're shaking hands at Sinai and they are agreeing to something. The vassal, knowing the suzerain, was common diplomatic language within these covenants. So all over the place, they would refer to the suzerain, would call the vassal to know him. And the prophets throughout the Old Testament are constantly talking about knowing the Lord. The Hebrew word is yada. It's a very common word, but what does it mean? What does it mean in the context of a covenant? Well, the meaning is exceedingly different for Hosea and how he uses it when he's summoning vassal Israel to know their suzerain, Yahweh. He wants them to actually go deeper than what ancient covenants meant by knowing Yahweh. He expands it in three primary ways, three big picture ideas. One, he expands it beyond the idea of knowing Yahweh from the Exodus, so we'll talk about that this morning. Two, he refers to creational harmonies dependent upon knowing God properly. And this goes all the way back to creation. The ground is cursed because of you, because you've broken the agreement between me and you, Adam. Cursed is the ground. It wasn't really a covenant, but it is. You can call it that if you want. The Bible doesn't call it a covenant, it just calls it creation. But the ground is messed up because God is no longer known by Adam and Eve properly. Hosea taps into this and says, your crops are failing because you worship the wrong God. You want creation to be set right. You want your food to start growing again. Know God properly, meaning exclusively. But we'll talk about that. And Yahweh's, this is a weird one. We may not get to this one today. Who knows? Yahweh's transcendence beyond ritual idolatry. He can be known, but he cannot be known through an idol. Yet, he's very intimately or imminently involved in creation. And you can use creation language to talk about him in really rich, majestic ways because he's close, but you can't know him through an idol. All of these are stemming from what the covenant in Exodus and Deuteronomy set up. But Hosea is very intentionally maneuvering through these three big ideas as he uses the term know Yahweh. So, let's start with this first one. My coffee's cold now. That makes it pointless. A motif running through portions of the book of Exodus is that Yahweh is acting so that Israel, Egypt, Pharaoh, all the nations under heaven may know that I am Yahweh. I've just given you a smattering of early places while they're still in Egypt. It doesn't change after they get out of Egypt, but this is the point. I want Pharaoh to know that I'm Yahweh. What does he mean by that? The big idea statement in Exodus is primarily focused on Yahweh wanting all people to know that he is the highest God, the true sovereign control of nations and people. It's actually kind of an early form of the gospel. I want people to understand who's in charge here. The gospel is about the story of how God put his son in charge of the universe, giving him all authority in heaven and earth. How? By going through crucifixion at the hands of the nations. The nations that he came to rule turned against him and killed him. God reverses his death sentence and proves that he was actually innocent in his claims and that he was who he was claiming to be, and now he rules the nations. But before all of that happens, where God turns the nations over to his son, God's saying, I'm in charge of Egypt. I rule the Nile. Not Pharaoh, not Horus, me. And I'm walking into Egypt and I'm going to fight your gods to prove it. This is spiritual warfare in the Old Testament. The Exodus is the picture of spiritual warfare in the Old Testament. So in Exodus, it's about knowing that Yahweh is king of both gods and men. That's it in a single sentence. Everything that God is doing in Exodus is mainly so that the people know, in a cognitive sense, who the God of heaven actually is. And it works because Rahab shows up a generation later and he says, we heard what happened last generation. We know that Yahweh says, I want to be with Yahweh, which means I'm with you guys. I'll turn my back on my own people if I can just be safe under your God. And God says, that's all I wanted. Great, let's do this. And the other nations have heard, she says. We all know Yahweh's reputation. We know who the true God of heaven is. We know who the sovereign king is. The question is not, do you know it cognitively? The question is, what are you going to do about it? So that's what Hosea is doing. He's moving beyond this particular meaning. Who rules in heaven? And he's actually moving and shifting to something else. So his focus is going to shift from the cognitive, that it's Yahweh, and in his case, not Baal, not any other gods, not any other Elohim, is the true sovereign, suzerain God to whom Israel owes exclusive allegiance, or faith, as Paul will call it. And he turns it into more of a moral, volitional kind of knowing. You're knowing Yahweh not through your recognition that he's the God of heaven. You should already have that knowledge. Now let's talk about what you do with that knowledge. You have to actually keep the covenant. It's throughout your everyday life, the moral volitional is how you're going to live with your will bent morally to Yahweh. If you acknowledge cognitively that he is the God of heaven, then you are acknowledging that he has the right to tell you what to do and define good and evil. And so he wants his people to actually start letting God define good and evil for them by seeing them actually obey their covenant stipulations. Just to go back to this one, this picture, your commitments, the things you have to do to fulfill your end of the covenant. I want you to do those things. Yes, there are things that you and I have to do in covenant with God today. As I've been trying to point out in talking about baptism, baptism is supposed to be the first thing. It's not pray this prayer. It's not give this offering. It's not buy this indulgence. It's get baptized, actually. So yes, moral, volitional, and cognitive are supposed to overlap and interrelate. Like this: those who cognitively believe that Yahweh is the highest authority in the universe must necessarily adapt their morality and volition to match his will at every level within society. A society that turns away from Yahweh is doing so by rejecting volitionally their will. They don't want to obey Yahweh. So they're turning their backs on him. They're going to define good and evil for themselves. This is Genesis 3. The knowledge of good and evil is let's define good and evil for ourselves instead of letting God tell us what good and evil is. And if you do that, you cannot be considered to have faith in him. Your allegiance is not to him. Your allegiance can't be to a king that you turn around and disobey. It doesn't work that way. Willful, intentional, defiant, rebellious disobedience. That's what we're talking about here. This is not, oh, I struggle with sin. This is, where do your loyalties lie? And if your loyalty is to Yahweh, you can't worship other gods. That's how it works. So their loyalty in Hosea's time is not to God, despite the fact that they will cognitively recite all the doctrine they got that says that he's the God of heaven, that he rules in the heavens. So this understanding and this obedience to Yahweh leads to knowing through experience the goodness of Yahweh's suzerain blessings in and through the land gifted to the people. So it should point out creation's falling apart because you don't know Yahweh properly, right? It says, if you want to experience proper creation the way it was meant to be, get to know God. And by that I mean get to obeying him. Get to actually living obedience to him. So the Exodus is focused more on the dimension of knowing who the correct God is. But Hosea is more focused on the multi-dimensional concept of actually being in an ongoing relationship with God by fulfilling our reciprocating relational responsibilities. And I think that is the proper way to say it. Okay, this is more than just cognitively recognizing who rules in heaven. This is properly living out that reality. That is beyond merely cognitive, but you can't exclude the cognitive, which is, I think, as we're going to get through this, what a lot of people want to do today.
Well, that's
So,
where you have to start.
yes, exactly. It's where you have to start.
Right.
And so for the Exodus and for the recovery of the nations, it's the starting point. It's the starting point for Israel. But they should be beyond this. They're hundreds of years past the Exodus. Lots has happened. Why can't they move beyond it? Why can't churches deepen their understanding of Yahweh? You can. This is the point of James. You can recite all the creeds in the world and you can cognitively know it, but that doesn't make you a mature Christian. For maturity, you actually have to obey. You actually have to do the things that God wants.
Which requires work.
Exactly. And that's where the rubber meets the road. It requires work, and we don't want to put in the work of the effort. We want our free grace. Luther promised it to us, and so has our preacher today, so why are we being told that we have to do anything about it? I just believe. Well, that's the problem. They also believed that Yahweh was the God of heaven, but they turned around and worshiped all the other gods, so they're out. They're apostates. Don't be that. To summarize all of this together in a modern paraphrased word, now that you know who the true God is, here's the things you actively do with that knowledge. As you do these things, here's some of the good blessings you can expect to come about. This is how Hosea is tying it all up together. You can learn very much today what discipleship is from Hosea as he unfolds this idea of knowing Yahweh as one of his major themes. You want to be a good disciple? You want to actually be obedient to the Lord? Here's what the things you actively do with the knowledge that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. That he rules in heaven at the right hand of the Father. That he has all authority in heaven and earth. Now, let's talk about what you do with that knowledge. And Hosea is very much doing that. At least he's certainly trying to. So, whereas the Exodus is primarily focused on revealing who the correct God in heaven is, by Yahweh going to war against the gods of Egypt and decimating their supposed dominance. Their propaganda is the Egyptian gods' rule. Hosea seeks for his audience to move beyond that initial recognition to deeper levels. Having already come to learn through their history that Yahweh alone is truly God, Israel should move to a more holistic way of relating to God by seeking to transform their everyday lives in ways that conform to his revealed will morally so that they may experience in an ongoing manner the goodness of having Yahweh as their sole suzerain God and King. Because they want all of this, and everybody wants all of these good things. They want to experience the goodness of God, but they don't want to fulfill their covenant responsibilities that God says are a prerequisite for his blessings on these levels. Now, we talked about Jeroboam II's 50-year reign leading up to this and where Hosea is at. And God is perfectly within his right to say, you know what, I have let the covenant curses fall on you. I have disciplined you over and over and over again. I'm just going to bless you and tell you before I do it that I'm going to be that I'm the God in heaven, that I'm going to bless you, Jeroboam. You're going to recover a bunch of land. You're going to have great economic prosperity all your days, and you're going to have peace. And then let's see if I can bless you into coming back to me. That doesn't work? Great. Then we're moving on. We're back to curses, and we're going straight into exile because you guys are just not on any level moving towards this call, accepting this call. Hosea's call and opportunities to his people are really no different than what the New Testament calls us to in Christ. Knowledge of God is still a multidimensional idea in which we cognitively understand and acknowledge that there is no higher authority than Yahweh and Jesus, whom he has raised up to sit at his right hand. Those gears in the old brain need to turn so that we recognize this as a statement of truth about reality. But genuine belief that recognizes this biblical message is true necessarily leads us to conforming our own lives to match his will, revealed will, by our own moral volitional growth through obedience, even as we continue to grow cognitively in understanding that's found in his written word. Growing our moral volitional knowledge of God is necessarily dependent on growing our cognitive knowledge of God. It's a fancy way of saying if you don't learn to discipline your mind and learn new things about who God is, let him reveal truth about himself, statements about who he is, you will never actually conform your life to His will and therefore get to know Him on the deepest levels available. And this is a slow, daily grind of the lifelong commitment to Him being lived out. This is not, I want a big emotional experience. Let me go to this conference or something that the mail sent me. Let me go to youth camp or something and have a big week of no sleep and therefore high running emotions and stuff. And this should make sense to you because we've already talked about this in 2 Peter. It is the very homily. For this reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, virtue to virtue, knowledge to knowledge, self-control. It's like he starts with the creeds, the desire for virtue, and he moves to, you're going to have to increase your knowledge base. This is the cognitive way of saying you need to increase cognitively in the old brain hole. But it's not the end goal. Your cognitive increasing should lead to self-control, perseverance. Your virtue actually builds this way until it wells up with sacrificial love, being the highest of the virtues. This ought to lead to experiencing God in deeper relational knowing of Yahweh in ways that go beyond circumstances or emotions. Oh God, I love you so much. Oh no, things turned bad. Dang it, God, why did you do this? And you just let yourself be interrupted by negative life circumstances from actually getting to know God. And the thing that I really want to hammer home to you about this is that I think in modern America, churches, the way we have commercialized Christianity today, following the trends of our materialistic society around us, is that we're trying to make a shortcut to holiness in a new way. I say new, it happens pretty much every generation, but it's very strong now. We need to understand there are no shortcuts to any place worth going. And if you're going to go to this place, deep knowledge, personal, for all the language that you hear that Christianity is a personal relationship with God, you don't hear much actually explaining how do you go about relating to God. All you hear is it's not a religion, it's a relationship. Okay, but relationships are built on commitment, are built on reciprocating responsibilities to people based on how you define your relationship to them. And we don't talk about these deeper things about how to go about it. And then you get people who just jump to the practical. We'll just do this, 1, 2, or 3, and it doesn't really help because it just devolves into sheep who can't think, having to lean on and just obey whatever the pastor tells them to do, when the pastor should be educating the sheep so that they can get up and walk on their own. So when a person wants to know God in Christ without growing cognitively or in the moral volitional realm, that person is seeking a shortcut that doesn't exist. We cannot long for mere experiences without working hard to understand God cognitively and putting His Word into practice in our lives morally or with our wills, our volition. And I think this is problematic because we understand enough about the Word of God to know we're supposed to know God. We understand that cognitively. But in our ignorance, it's very easy to be manipulated into knowing God means coming to this conference, having this experience, feeling these emotions. And see, if you read this statement carefully, it doesn't exclude that as part of the process. It's trying to put the process in the correct order so that experiences are actually supposed to come last. They're the result of the commitment to the Lord all the way through. So, people who seek to have strong emotional experiences or emotional catharsis about God, for instance, a teenager at a youth camp, because those are the very young minds, easily influenced, and they make these great commitments and then they go back to their lives and they can't follow God morally or volitionally, and the churches that are failing them in the capacity to do that. I think in those as an example. People who want those experiences, but who do not go on knowing God by getting their everyday lives to conform to His will, do not truly know God or have any hope of experiencing Him beyond that emotional level, which is usually dependent on other people's to provide it. Hey, I'm hungry. I I don't have God in my life, and I know it, and I'm dry, and I'm hungry, and I want more. And your answer is, well, okay, well, we're having this event coming up. Just come to this event. Is the wrong thing to tell people. And we default to it in modern society. Churches, ministries, other institutions that seek to provide emotional fulfillment without making genuine disciplined followers of the Lord at the cognitive and moral volitional levels, first, will not please God with the response to them at judgment. The modern American Christian says, Lord, Lord, we held massive evangelical services. We had great emotional times of singing. We had late night sharing. We stayed up until 3 a.m. once a year at our youth camp, and we shared and we shared and we didn't shut up and we cried, and aren't you just so pleased? And the Lord says, no, that's not what I wanted. You perpetuated an entire business model of selling emotional experiences without ever actually leading a single person beyond it to genuinely know me, to seeing my will done in their lives at the deeper levels, beyond the cognitive into the moral levels. You just ran straight to experiences. Why would I reward you for that? I don't even know who you are. Get away from me. And it becomes, for so many Christians who seek experiences first, but the biblical idea is that they're supposed to come last. The experience of submitting our hearts and minds to Him in ongoing commitment. It's just the Christian version of the get-rich-quick scheme. It becomes a get-rich-quick becomes a get-holy-quick Christianity. And whoever has the strongest emotions is the most holy and the most godly, and it doesn't matter what you did before you came here. The important thing is that you're making this declaration in front of everybody today. You're not going to follow through it on 24 hours, and nobody's at this church is really going to help you, and all this stuff, and quite frankly, that's on you, and all this stuff, and it doesn't work. It doesn't make the kind of people that God wants. Faithful people beyond circumstances. So I think American Christianity has devolved to seek experiences without actually doing the work involved in knowing God through long-term devotion and hard work. We need to let go of the model that says, come here and you'll have a big experience. We'll connect you with God or something. That inherent, implied promise by paying to come to their event and to their big old amphitheater or school or wherever they do it, and all the music that they're going to promise and stuff, and just learn to actually strip all that back and say, all right, let me teach you how to open the Bible. This is a Bible. It has two major halves. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you walk through it and you say, this is kind of the things you need to learn so that you can read it properly. These are the things you have to cognitively learn to do what it says. But you have to understand what it says and do what it says. And you have to stop expecting that if you do it for an hour a day or 30 minutes a day or something, that the goal is to have this big emotional catharsis at the end of the 30 minutes or something to connect with God. And saying, you might have to do this day after day for 6 months before you have a breakthrough. And in that regard, it's like, isn't that why people go to so much counseling and stuff? You go to counseling week after week, or you talk to your psychiatrist or something week after week. Do you have a breakthrough week after week? No, but you still spend an hour discussing it, hopefully more time outside of those sessions, trying to work through your problems and stuff. We know that that's not the case. We know that no healthy relationship actually works this way, and then we try and work it out this way. It doesn't work. And it's not actually what God is calling any of us to. So you have to put the hard work in day after day and not expect the emotional experiences to come on demand. You have to know that eventually they're going to come because they're a part of the process, but you're not actually in control of it. You're just looking to connect with God. And when you connect with God and you break through and you show Him that you're serious about committing to Him, in getting your life worked out in discipline, seeking Him in prayer and Bible reading and intake and stuff, and trying to understand and doing that hard work, God tests you in those moments and say, I'm not going to withhold myself, but I'm going to see how serious you actually are about this. And you go for 6 weeks, you go for 6 months, you may have to go for a year or more or something, just going and going and going. You feel like you're not getting anywhere, and then one day God says, boom, I was always here. This is me. And you've proven yourself committed to me. So here's more of me. Or at least you're now more capable of understanding the me that's here. I'm bigger than this. I'm more than your life. And you need to be the thing that changed. going and having an emotional experience or looking primarily for that emotional experience isn't going to get you there. It's actually going to hinder you in a lot of ways from getting there.
And it's short-lived.
It is short-lived, yes. Because I always think of this in terms of when Jesus was talking about the parable of the seed being scattered. And he says, some seed was scattered on rocky terrain and it didn't go into the ground and nothing happened. Other seed was thrown onto some pretty good soil and it immediately was planted and it grew a crop, but also the thorns and thistles. And he says the worries of life came and sucked it out, and then those things immediately died. It says, and yet still again, seed was actually planted in good soil, and that seed produced a crop. Well, anybody in an agrarian society knows that your crop doesn't just spring up overnight. And he says, anybody would have listening to that parable would have been suspicious to say, wait a second, the crops just grew up overnight? Well, no wonder they died just as quickly. Nothing worth having or growing in farm culture grows that fast. Nothing worth being happens that fast. It is a lot of hard work.
And it doesn't grow alone. That's why the thorns and thistles showed up.
And so we need to actually grow together and know that, okay, wait, I'm not the only person struggling to understand this thing or read my Bible. I'm not the only person struggling to actually develop a prayer life. As it turns out, I'm in a community of people who are also struggling to do the same things. Let's get together and talk about that and share our struggles and encourage each other on towards, we know we still have to do it, let's just keep it up. And eventually the breakthrough comes. Eventually creation gets set to right. Which is the second thing, and how he's contextualizing these ideas. Creational harmony is dependent upon knowing God. So let's read Hosea 4, 1 through 3, because this insinuates that creation is being undone because the people of God are in rebellion against His will. It says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land." This is about as courtroom legalistic as Hosea gets in his. Remember last week we talked about marriage and sonship being his. This is actually a legal form of saying it. And he says, there is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. And if I remember correctly, the word acknowledgement is that same Hebrew word, yada, for knowing God. You don't know God, you don't acknowledge God. It's the same thing, even if it's not the same word. In this land, there's only cursing, stealing, adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land dries up. All who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the fish of the sea are swept away. So Hosea's contextualization idea is this: creation crumbles when humanity refuses to know God. The lack of knowledge of God leads to cosmic upheaval that reverses and undoes creation in verse 3. This idea goes all the way back to the curse in Genesis 3. As I've already mentioned, Adam, because you have done this, preferred the voice of your wife over my voice. The sin is not that he listened to his wife, it's that he should have listened to God instead of his wife. Cursed is the ground because of you. And then as humanity is devolving between Genesis 3 down to Genesis 6, Noah's father names him Noah, which means rest, is saying we need rest from this land cursed and how hard it's become to actually live on the land. And then as we're going to get to this coming Wednesday, when Noah gets out of the boat, sacrifices the animals, prays and builds an altar and worships the Lord, and he smells the aroma, God says, I will never again curse the land because of humans. I will let it rest. The exile is in part, as the prophets will tell us, about the Sabbath getting its rest. Creation itself is tired and needs a break from you people, right? So I'm going to bring you guys back, but first I'm going to let the land rest from you people. So the idea is that when humanity doesn't know God, the very fabric of creation is actually torn apart. Huang says the intersection of ethical and cosmic order in Hosea is not unique to Israel, but common to the ancient Near East. So you will find this beyond the Bible. This is a very common thing. If you don't obey the gods, if you don't stay within your place in society and perform your function in society, creation will unravel. Now, they use it in an oppressive way because God, obviously giving us freedom, says you can move to different places in society based on your own choices. In fact, the founding fathers built a framework in our Constitution that gave people the freedom to actually make their own choices and move to different places in society. But if you're going to move there, you have to accept the responsibility, right? So as long as you're fulfilling the responsibility, creation can be greater because of that. If you just want the stuff without the responsibility, you're probably going to fail. So sin needs to be taken seriously because there's always a connection between human ethics and cosmic order. Our sins do not merely break down our ability to relate to God in some private sense that doesn't affect anybody else, because all living humans relate in 4 dimensions. They relate to themselves, they relate to God, they relate to other people, and they relate to creation. So this one is tying, you need to know God and have a better relationship with God, to saying, and if you do, you can experience a better creation in this world. Life will go better. If you stop committing to Baal and expect Baal to solve your fertility problems or your crop problems, and just commit to God, God will give you more children, and God will give you more food to feed those children. This is Hosea's message. So sinful rebellion against God's will tears at the very fabric of all 4 components of this relationship. You unweave enough components through enough sin, and the entire cosmic order that preserves and unite all 4 levels of human existence in this world will come undone. And where Hosea is really breaking new grounds with this, because most of that is all just general ancient Near Eastern teaching, Hosea breaks new ground through the covenant idea that God is actually going to remarry Israel after the divorce of the exile. And that's actually going to be the solution. Instead of the gods just getting upset and punishing humans, God is going to intentionally punish humans and then rebuild the knowledge between them. Restoration will come through the people knowing their God. As Isaiah, a contemporary of Hosea, is going to say, in the end, when God restores creation, knowledge of God will be as the waters in the ocean, as great and mighty. If you're looking at a map of Israel back here on the Mediterranean, you look out and you see the Mediterranean, and you see just how much water is out there, and you say, knowledge of God is going to happen on the land as much as that water out there covers the ocean. And it's knowledge that is not merely cognitive, but through the moral volitional lives of people who are actually striving to conform to His will. One day, you Israelites are going to get this, because I, God, am going to step in and do some things that are going to help you where you're failing. And those things become remarriage, reworking the covenant, and actually giving His wife, His bride, His church, His own Spirit within them, and not just commandments written on stone, so that they can actually know this God better. So let's end right around here today. Does it seem to you that society is coming unraveled today on any level?
That's rhetorical, right?
Yes. I mean, I would hope so. There's so much fighting. There's so much disagreement in our society these days. Does it seem that order in our society is harder and harder to maintain? I can't be the only one who sees it, right?
More rhetorical.
I hope so. But I have to ask the question to know. So what sins that our society didn't accept, 60 years ago when society was a little bit stronger? What ideas, not just sins, what ideas did they didn't accept 60 years ago, but are now basically expected in every life? And how has that led to cosmic upheaval over the generations? How much of this can creation actually stand? How much more do you think we can go through this idea of saying a man doesn't need a wife and a woman doesn't need a husband? That ain't working out very well for our society to make that basic claim that everybody should just look after their own interests.
They don't even know what a wife or a husband is.
So we're already undoing. As I mentioned before, marriage is referred to as a covenant, which means you should ask yourself the question, well, what things am I supposed to fulfill? What responsibilities and duties am I supposed to have to this covenant partner? Can you define them? Do you know what they are? And too many ideas have been pulling at the notion of how a man properly, or at least best, relates to a woman in the deepest levels. I mean, knowing your wife is a way of referring not merely to the sex within your marriage, but also to just the deeper parts of your marriage that sex is supposed to embody. In the Bible, knowing your wife has to do with actually fulfilling your covenant responsibilities to your wife, and the same for the wife to her husband. And if you will do this, you sit down and say, okay, what are my responsibilities? And the ancient world had this figured out in ways that we have forgotten or intentionally ignored. That guy here, he can't be the mother. This woman here, she can't be the father. Did you ever think that the ancients actually had a wisdom to the fact that if she's going to actually bear image bearers, bear children, what does getting pregnant do to the woman's body? It drastically weakens the body because the baby kind of acts as a parasite for a long time, right? Even after the baby is born, it's still kind of a parasite, but for slightly different reasons. But biologically, it weakens the woman's physical capabilities, which are not at nothing, but they tend to go down during pregnancy. So God gave the responsibility for protection to the one who's not biologically weakened by the baby-making process. He knows what he's doing when he creates Adam first, brings him to the garden, and gives him time to prepare. Gives him time to set things up and organize the animal kingdom before he brings the woman to him and said, all right, be fruitful and multiply now, because the process is going to drastically weaken her in cycles over and over again. She has a baby, she's weak after the birth, and so his responsibility should be pick up some of the daggum slack, right? Do some things, and it's not just between these two, the entire family structure around it comes into play. Your parents who are done rearing children can come in and help in the process. Kids, as they get older, can take up the responsibility, and it becomes a give and take of responsibility to one another. But our society is failing because we say, anything a woman can do, a man can do, which is, anything a human can do, a man or a woman can do, but there are some things women can do that men can't, like the baby making. And so we view God with suspicion of saying, well, I don't want to have a baby. Why does God make me have babies or something? How could God do that? Let me just not be this. I want to be a career woman or something. It's like, okay, you have that choice. You can make it, and there's not technically anything wrong with it. You're not going to be condemned for it. But, that attitude of viewing God and His creation with suspicion means that you might actually miss out on the depth of actually knowing another person and birthing another person. An image bearer. Sharing responsibilities and being responsible for teaching that image bearer responsibilities. Maybe more than one, it's not a bad thing. Our society has screwed this up. It has misdefined it. I mentioned in this previous slide here, going back 60 years, because this was roughly 60 to 70 years now, the sexual revolution of free love and the movement that says marriage is now irrelevant. It's just a social institution and it's worthless. We can have the closeness and the intimacy by having all the sex with anybody that we want without actually having the responsibility to another person, without making commitments. Well, as it turns out, if you don't make commitments and keep your commitments to your spouse, your ability to know and relate to that person is going to break up, because it's designed to mirror the ability to relate to the Creator. You have to be committed to God. You have to stop missing church because you just don't want to go today or something. You need to deal with that moral volitional choice and actually be so committed to God that there's not a question in anybody's mind where you're going to be on a Sunday, and work that commitment out. And that's the thing with marriage, and that's the thing with God. You make a commitment to somebody, and then you have to figure it out day to day. You have to make a commitment to God, and then you have to go figure it out for the rest of the year. When you make the commitment, you don't even fully know the person. You don't know everything that there is to know about them when you say, I do. And you have to figure out, well, now that I said I do, what does that really entail? And you realize the bar was actually much, much higher than you ever anticipated. That's the same for everybody. That's natural. That's how it works. Well, as it turns out, when you get into a relationship with God, it's the same thing. You did not fully understand what being committed to God in Jesus Christ was going to mean. But you have a choice. You can either back out of it and never be blessed again and ultimately be an apostate and burn in hell, or you can just work out your commitments to Him. Figure it out, even though that it's hard, and you can get help with that in the process. And you can find that God will actually Himself help you, and you'll make it through, and you'll be just fine. So go do that.
Better.
You'll be better.
Fine.
Things will get better if you do this across time.